So Tim Whitmarsh, I mean, I read a few years, maybe a year ago, I was reading in the Wall Street Journal and I read a review of a book, the book that, about atheism in ancient battling the gods. And I was extremely excited. I read the book and I said, I'm going to invite this person to come speak at the Center for Global Humanities. And I did extend an invitation and he's gracefully accepted. And so it took a while for him to come here. He just came, he really was in China only 3 days ago. 3 days ago, flew into Cambridge, right? And then spent less than a day, or maybe 24 hours or so, and now took another flight to come to give us a lecture at the Center for Global Humanities. So we're extremely grateful, and thank you so much for making the effort. So Tim Whitmarsh is a A.G. Leventis Professor of Greek Culture at the University of Cambridge. He also holds honorary positions at the Universities of Pretoria, Exeter, and Oxford. He has written a number of books on ancient Greek and Roman literature, culture, and thought. In 2015, he was awarded the Goodwin Order of Merit by the Society of Classical Studies. Battling the Gods was widely covered, the book that I read. That's fascinating, and I highly recommend it. Battling the Gods was widely covered by mainstream press in North America and across Europe. The New York Times called it excellent, beautifully written, highly persuasive, said the Literary Review. As learned as it's intellectually thrilling, said the New Statesman. Brilliant, illuminating, invigorating, urgent book, The Guardian said. He has appeared on TV and radio in America, Britain, Canada, Australia, and South Africa. So without much ado, please help me welcome Tim Whitmarsh to the podium.
Well, thank you so much for that generous introduction. Thank you also for the invitation. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be here talking to, as Anouar said, talking to a full house. It's great to see so many people coming out. Also, congratulations and félicitations to the students. So the title of this lecture is How to be an Atheist, the Ancient Greek Way. Atheism can often seem to us to be one of the defining features of modernity, secular modernity, but also of Western modernity. But in fact, actually, it has a much deeper and richer history, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. China, Greece, and India provide the best documented sources for atheism in the ancient world. My focus will be on Greece, partly because that's where my specialism lies, but partly also because actually that's where the evidence really is richest, deepest, and easiest to use as well. But also partly because the word atheist, the modern word atheist, is a Greek word, and I'm going to make quite a lot of play out of that. What do we actually mean by atheism? Now, this question is more problematic than it might first appear. It's very easy, of course, for us now to decide on a definition and simply plonk it back onto antiquity and see whether the ancient evidence matches up. And that would be a very familiar, very obvious procedure. Say we define it here, we look in the, I don't know, in a Webster's dictionary or something like that, and then we look in the ancient sources and see whether the two match up. But if we begin to look for something that resembles our modern scientific materialist conception of atheism, then I think we're doomed, really. We're doomed to find only a limited amount of corresponding material because, of course, antiquity wasn't like our world. It didn't have scientific materialism. It didn't have secularism in quite the same way. It didn't have the European Enlightenment in its background. We'll end up, therefore, seeing antiquity as only a primitive version of modernity, as something that looks like an atrophied, weakened, slender version of modernity. And that's not a very helpful way of proceeding. It means that rather than attempting to understand an ancient culture on its own terms, we simply project onto it our own assumptions. Now, this is particularly problematic given that, as I mentioned earlier, the word atheist and atheism are Greek in origin. It's surely bad method to insist on modern definitions without trying to understand how the Greeks themselves used these words and how they understood these terms. We need to readjust our lenses so as to see with Greek eyes, not our own. And that's really the message of today's lecture, but that's also what my subject, classical studies, is really about. It's trying to get people to try to see the world afresh, to see the world using ancient material and using the amazing gift that we have of all this very rich, very thoughtful, very powerful material, which looks at a world which is recognizably like our own, but looks at it through very different lenses. Now, the word atheos, which I'll leave untranslated for now, first appeared in the 5th century BCE. It's a particular feature of the Greek language that the letter A, or alpha, can be attached to the beginning of a word to signify absence. Okay, so many words in modern English borrow this feature. So, for example, if you want to describe something as lacking in system, you might call it asystematic. Or if you want to describe a state without rule, archer, you describe it as anarchic. Okay, it's the same principle of putting an alpha on the beginning to negate. And atheos, the root of the modern English word atheist, is similar. It implies the lack of a theos, of a god. But etymology only gets us so far. The word is found, first of all, in poetry, particularly in Athenian tragic drama of the 5th century BCE, where it signifies not somebody who doesn't believe in the gods, but someone who's abandoned by the gods, or in archaic English, God-forsaken, if you like. And in this sense, it's typically used in conjunction with other negative adjectives, in phrases such as God-forsaken, unruly, and lawless. So in Greek, those are 3 negative words, 3 words beginning with that A or that alpha. This kind of phrase is used, I mean, anyone who knows anything about Greek tragedy knows that there's an awful lot of desperation going on in Greek tragedy, but it's typically used of these people who are in a state of absolute alienation from society. Okay, these people who've been abandoned by the gods, abandoned by law, they have no purchase on law themselves, and they are beyond human civilization. It suggests the kind of wild, barbaric state that people end up when they're completely outside of the proper civilized structures of Greek society. Now, that's the early-ish 5th century, but at some point in the later 5th century, or perhaps the early 4th century, the word atheos begins to take on something like its modern sense of one who does not believe in the gods. The first unambiguous example of the word being used in this sense is in Plato's account of the trial of Socrates, his text known as the Apology. Now, Socrates was tried in 399 BCE for, amongst other things, introducing new gods. And one of his accusers, we're told, asked him if he was an atheos. And his reply is very interesting. He said, "I certainly do believe that gods exist. I'm not an out-and-out atheos." Now, the words may not be Socrates' own, but they're written up by Plato within 15 years after his trial. Okay, so at some point in the 4th century, we have the first attested use of the word atheos, meaning something like someone who doesn't believe in the gods. Now, Socrates goes on to argue that his accusers are confusing him. When they call him an atheos, they're confusing him with the philosopher Anaxagoras, who was going around in Greece, in Athens, in about 430 BCE, arguing that stars and planets are not divine, but they're made of rocks, they're made of physical substance. And this suggests that, for Socrates at least, the word atheos was already, by this stage, in 399 BCE, associated with formal philosophical arguments that the gods do not exist, or at least that they have a limited impact on our world. But we're still not quite there yet. Was the word used in a positive or negative sense at this stage? Now, modern sociologists speak of in-group and out-group labels. An in-group label is used by the group itself. An out-group label is used by others of it. Now, most forms of religious or ideological identification are in-group labels. If you say, I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim, I'm a communist, whatever, that is an in-group label. You are deciding to associate yourself with a particular band of people. Out-group labels, by contrast, tend to be more aggressive and less tightly defined. You might say, they are barbarians, for example. Greeks were very fond of calling other people barbarians. Out-group labels tend to be more abusive as well. And we know that in the modern era, there are lots of out-group labels that are attached particularly to certain races or people with certain sexual preferences. Now, the question is, was atheos an in-group or an out-group label at this stage? It's not actually very easy to tell from Socrates' words. He's associating the word with a philosopher, Anaxagoras, who practiced some 30 years before the trial, but he doesn't tell us whether Anaxagoras would have used this word himself or whether there were others who would have identified with Anaxagoras as atheoi. So we're beginning to ask the question now of whether atheist was simply a negative term, whether it was still a negative term here, which was used as it was in Greek tragedy to label people who were in a particularly parlous state, or whether it's beginning in this era to take on some sort of sense of a philosophical position that you could buy into, that anyone might be persuaded into. Now, the particular challenge is presented by any history of classical Athens, like any period of antiquity, but particularly there's a distinctive component here, is one of sources. From one perspective, we have extraordinarily rich sources for classical Athens, which are actually unparalleled in the Greek world in this era. So we have the historians Herodotus and Thucydides. We have the dramatic poets I mentioned earlier, the tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. We also have the comic poet Aristophanes. Now, these poets deal with myths and fictions, but they often preserve many contemporary ideas. We also have public orators like Demosthenes. We have the philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. So in a sense, a huge amount of stuff. But there are still plenty of gaps. None of these writers is, of course, interested in everything. So they all have blind spots. These sources are rather like large, fecund islands, but there's still an awful lot of sea in between the islands. Atheism, unfortunately, sits in the middle of one of these seas. It is in the blind spot of a lot of these writers. None of our sources from 5th century Athens deal systematically with the history of those who reject traditional ideas about the gods. The best evidence, in fact, comes from later on in the 4th century BCE, about 350 BCE, when the philosopher Plato composed his great work, his last work, the Laws. Here, an anonymous Athenian imagines himself creating laws specifically to punish those clever young types, that's the phrase that he uses, who question the existence or the influence of gods. The Athenian continues, you and your friends, he's imagining himself addressing one of these clever young types now, you and your friends are not the first to have held this view about the gods. There are always those who suffer from this illness, he doesn't like it, obviously, this illness, in greater or lesser numbers. So according to this character in Plato, as I say, about 350 BC, in the middle of the 4th century, there are people going around in his day who pride themselves on not believing in gods. And indeed, Plato says, this is a widespread feature of Greek society generally. So we have here a glimpse into, potentially, one of the smaller islands, if you like, between the bigger islands. Perhaps an island populated by clever young types who don't believe in the gods. But Plato doesn't tell us who these people are. He doesn't tell us how many they were or how they identified themselves. He doesn't say whether they called themselves atheoi, atheists. Nor does he tell them anything about their reasons for these claims. To explore these questions more deeply, we need to use later sources still. And here we confront one of the other great problems of ancient Greek history in general, that between the 4th century BCE and the 1st century BCE, this is the period which is usually known as the Hellenistic period, we have very few prose texts. We only have a large collection of very interesting, sophisticated, complex poems produced in the new capitals founded by Alexander the Great. Typically, Egyptian Alexandria is the most important of these capitals, and we have an extraordinary store of poetry produced in this place. But we don't have the prose texts that, if you like, sort of give us the fibre of history, that tell us the substance of what people are doing and thinking. So the next stage, if we're looking for evidence for these atheists in classical Athens, we have to go a stage further down the line into the culture of the Roman Empire. And in fact, the best sources for our early classical period are actually half a millennium later. They're in the 2nd century CE. And with these sources, inevitably, we have to ask ourselves whether they're preserving records that are accurate of what really went on in classical Athens, remember 500 years or so earlier, or whether they've distorted or even invented some of the features that are going on. Okay. There's no reason to think that these later sources are disingenuous, that they're lying to us or anything, but we all know how history works, that over the course of time, things get brought in, things get distorted, things get changed. Now, one absolutely crucial source for our question of whether there are atheists in classical Athens is a text called The Lives of the Eminent Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius. Diogenes Laertius wasn't a philosopher himself, but he was a compiler of other people's philosophical ideas, and it's an absolute treasure trove for the wider history of philosophy, not just these big islands of Plato and Aristotle, but all of the smaller islands in between. And as I say, it's a goldmine for us. One of the things that he tells us is that in the late 4th century, there was a man called Theodorus who followed the so-called Cyrenaic school, named after Cyrene in Libya. The Cyrenaic school held that pleasure is the ultimate good in life. Now, this Theodorus, we read, was known as the Atheist. He was called by his friends, presumably, Theodorus the Atheist. Very interesting. We're also told that he completely rejected, I'm quoting now, quoting a translation, obviously, completely rejected belief in the gods. He had, what is more, a set of followers who were known as the Theodorians, who, Diogenes tells us, held the same beliefs as him. In other words, when we get to the end of the 4th century, 50 years after Plato wrote the Laws, and 100 or so years after Socrates' trial, by the time we get to this stage, we have evidence, if we can trust these later sources, we have evidence for self-proclaimed atheists apparently defining themselves philosophically by the absence of belief in gods. Now, as we'll see shortly, the later we go in history, the more robust our evidence becomes for the existence of these atheists. But let's remain just for a short time now in classical Athens at the point of emergence of this atheistic tradition. It seems to me, and I'm going to go on to give the reasons for this, it seems to me, on balance, very likely that something substantially changed in 5th century Athens that generated the conditions for the emergence of disbelief in gods, for the emergence of what Plato calls these clever young types who reject traditional ideas in gods. So what was it that changed? What was it that created this fertile ground in which atheism could, for the first time in recorded Western history, appear and seem to have something like a name, even if it's not exactly the same name as ours today? Now, Athens in the 5th century famously saw a democratic revolution. Throughout this century, the Athenians reorganized their political structure so that decision-making was taken not by kings or elites, but by the citizen body in a public assembly. Now, there remained, of course, a high level of exclusion. Women, slaves, those who weren't born to Athenian parents, none of these were permitted to vote. But still, in terms of ancient society, this was a revolutionary shift. And it was felt as such. The Athenians knew that what they were doing was radical and unprecedented. One of the effects of this shift was to transform the Athenians' relationship to their traditional culture and religion, which was, of course, embodied not in sacred texts like the Quran or the Bible, but in a fluid body of oral mythology and epic poetry, associated now with names like Homer and Hesiod. Athenians did feel themselves closely connected to their cultural past. In fact, they often presented themselves as the primary heirs and curators of that past. If you close your eyes and imagine ancient Greece now, you'll probably see the Parthenon. The Parthenon is a very traditional building that preserves, if you like, even though it's a huge and, if you like, sort of very bold statement of Athenian identity, a very sort of in-your-face nationalist, it's not quite the right word, but it's a nationalist statement of what Athens is all about. Nevertheless, it has very traditional motifs on it, and in particular, it has depictions of the gods and mythological events around the artwork around the side. So Athenians did think of themselves as curators of the cultural past, but there was also a really strong sense of distance, of separation, that mythology was something that belonged to the past, to a pre-modern era. So if you like, classical Athens really invented not just philosophical revolutions, but also the very concept of modernity, the very concept that they were a people who had an ambiguous, tense relationship with their past. They were connected to their past, but nevertheless distanced from it. Now, we see the effects of this distancing very clearly in Athenian tragic drama, which very often deals with mythological subject matter, but does so in a way that suggests precisely this process of estrangement. This estrangement naturally includes an estrangement from beliefs, traditional beliefs in the gods. I want to consider one fragment from a play by Euripides, the third. There were three great tragedians in classical Athens: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And Euripides is the latest of these, and often felt to be the most sophisticated, but also the most sort of philosophical, if you like, and in a way, perhaps the least tragic in the conventional sense. He's the one who punctures the mythological illusion of the earlier poets. So it's just a fragment. We don't have the complete play, but it's from a play called Bellerophon. Now, Bellerophon is a mythical figure who gets the winged horse Pegasus and flies up to Mount Olympus. And in traditional myth, this is seen as the word that is often used, it's a slightly inaccurate word to use, but the word that's often used is hubristic, a very hubristic gesture. Okay, so going up to Olympus, trying to enter the halls of Olympus yourself, that's not something that you're supposed to do in traditional Greek culture. So the horse is made to buck, and he goes tumbling down to earth and injures himself severely. And that's a kind of just punishment for trying to invade the territory of the gods. In Euripides' play, we don't really know exactly what happened. We know that he flew up to heaven and that this was enacted actually on the tragic stage itself. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Deus Ex Machina, the famous crane thing that swings in gods in the tragic stage. Well, this was used in Bellerophon, in this play, to swing Bellerophon himself up onto the set building, which was represented the gates of Mount Olympus. Okay, so he did fly up to Olympus, but he also seems to have engaged in philosophical questioning of the nature of the gods, and this is where we return to our subject matter. So I'm going to begin by reading out a little bit of this fragment. Does someone say, says Bellerophon, does someone say that there are indeed gods in heaven? There are not. There are not, he says, if a man is willing not to rely foolishly on the antiquated reasoning. Consider for yourselves, do not base your opinion on words of mine. Now, the speaker clearly denies the existence of gods, but what's particularly interesting is the way that he phrases this denial. There are not, if a man is willing not to rely foolishly on the antiquated reasoning. We're rejecting the old way of doing things. The phrase meaning antiquated reasoning in Greek is palaios logos, which could also mean the old story, the old mythologies, the works of Homer and Hesiod and so forth. So the speaker here is not just rejecting belief in the gods, he's also rejecting the old ways of conceptualizing the gods, defining himself, if you like, as a modernist. So here we have a classic statement of Athenian intellectual confidence. Although the drama is set in the mythological past and it features a mythological character, this mythological character himself turns his back on mythology. Because it's a very complex play with time, if you like, and very characteristic not just of Athenian intellectual confidence, but also of this brilliant poet Euripides. Now, the speaker goes on in the bit that I've just quoted to say, consider for yourselves, do not base your opinion on words of mine. Now, you can hear, even in the translation, that this isn't high poetry. These are the words of a philosophical educator, one who's trying to teach his students how to consider, to use the Greek, or at least the English translation of the Greek phrase, how to consider, how to think for themselves. This is the language, as I say, of philosophical education. Now, the speaker then goes on to explain how he's reached this position of disbelief in the gods, using a kind of philosophical argument for the non-existence. I say myself, he says, that tyranny kills very many men and deprives them of their possession, and that tyrants break their oaths to ransack cities, and in doing so, they're more prosperous under heaven than men who live quietly in reverence from day to day. Okay, so tyrants do terrible things to human beings, but they seem to do much better than people who live in piety. I know too, he continues, of small cities doing honour to the gods, which are subject to larger, more impious ones, because they're overcome by a more numerous army. So same point there. You can pray all you like, but actually when it comes down to it, success is due to the size of your army. In other words, he says, the proof that gods do not exist in our world lies in the existence of injustice. If there were gods, they would punish wrongdoers and they would reward the pious. But that manifestly is not the case. Therefore, he concludes, there can be no gods in our world. And in fact, this is a version of what we now call the problem of evil. The existence of evil in our world proves that we can't have an omniscient, omnipotent, just God. So the argument goes. Now, the argument in Bellerophon's case has the form of what Aristotle would call a syllogism. That's to say, a technical philosophical argument from two premises to a conclusion. So premise one is, if there are gods, they exist to reward the virtuous and punish the wicked. Premise two is, the virtuous are not rewarded and the wicked are not punished. So if premise one and premise two hold, then the conclusion must be that there are no gods in the world. So, Euripides' play Bellerophon was performed in 426 BCE, so 27 years before the trial of Socrates. My own view, though I can't go into this here, is that it reflects the ideas of a man called Diagoras of Melos, who was really pivotal in the history of atheism. We know very little about him now. Very little of his works are preserved. But the one thing we do know is that in antiquity, he was always associated with atheism, that if you'd ask people who's the most famous atheos, most people would have said Diagoras of Melos. These later sources I mentioned earlier, like our friend Diogenes, the writer of the Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, record that there were a series of Greek thinkers who were called the Atheist, including Theodorus, and Diagoras is the earliest of these. So my own view is that Diagoras presented himself as a kind of mythological figure soaring up to Mount Olympus, like Bellerophon in Euripides' play, soaring up to the home of the gods and conducting a kind of metaphorical siege on the divine capital. But whereas in myth, figures like Bellerophon tried to enter physically, what Diagoras was doing was using philosophical argumentation to, if you like, tear down the walls of Olympus and to puncture the myth of divinity. I think it's also very likely that our friend Diagoras was the first person to have turned around the word atheos so that it was no longer an insult and became a positive marker of a philosophical position. And I mentioned earlier about in-group and out-group labels. One of the interesting things about in-group and out-group labels is the way that they can be flipped around from one to the other. So, I mean, a very obvious example of that in the modern world is the word queer, which when it was used initially to describe gay people was clearly an out-group label. It was a word that was designed to other gay people, but it has been reappropriated as a positive badge of identification and indeed an enabling label, as an in-group label, if you like. So I think that what Diagoras did was probably something very similar to this. He took a negative word, atheos, and made it into a positive statement of philosophical position. Now, there are many similar traces of atheistic thought that we can find in this early period. We have to weasel them out. We have to do this kind of exercise of looking in sources like tragic drama, but they are there. I think a fuller account of the reasons for this shift would have to include not just democracy, but also law. Athens made law the center of its democratic revolution. And with the changing role of law in Greek society came a changed understanding of what it was to prove something, what it was to create truth. In law courts, evidence, plausibility, and proof became the most powerful weapons. And this was the political background against which people like Euripides were writing. They knew that truth was defined as something that you infer from evidence. And we can see the same sort of thing going on in this Bellerophon fragment, that what he's doing is he's saying, let's look at the world for evidence of the existence of gods, and let's try to infer from that evidence whether it is plausible that gods exist. And this is legalistic thinking. So I think the centrality of law to democratic Athens really was one of the seeds that created, if you like, the possibility of atheism. But let's move on in time. As I say, the later that we go in classical antiquity, the more robust our evidence gets. We've seen that Greek atheists, and perhaps even people that identified themselves as atheoi, appeared first in Athens in the 5th century BCE. Now, they were atheists, if you like, but there's no evidence this early on for atheism as a coherent philosophical idea. Perhaps the followers of Theodorus, the Theodorians who rejected the belief in gods, perhaps we could say that they were that was an atheism, that was a movement celebrating atheism, but it wasn't really put together into a collective package. We don't have atheism, we don't have a kind of primer of atheism surviving from this era. It seems most likely that the early atheists focused individually on particular areas. So we've got evidence, for example, for people arguing that religion is a human social construct designed to control primitive people. And again, it's this Athenian modernist idea that we don't need that anymore because we are now modern. That was in the past. Some people argued that the gods are metaphorical ways of expressing elements in the natural world, like air and water and fire and so forth. Others put forward radically materialist views of the world. There's no such thing as spirit, there's no such thing as divinity. All we have is matter and void around us. Some argued, like the speaker in Euripides, that the existence of injustice in this world demonstrates the non-existence of gods. But these are all sort of, if you like, individual stars that are not yet fitted into a collective constellation that we might call atheism. For that, we have to wait another 200 years, long after the disappearance of Athenian democracy. The abstract noun denoting atheism is much later than the word atheos, meaning atheist. And this probably dates to the 2nd century BCE and to the Sceptical Academy of Clitomachus. Now, what's the Sceptical Academy of Clitomachus? First, some historical context. Democracy falls in Athens in the late 4th century BCE. This is as a result of the conquests of Philip and Alexander, who conquered the Greek mainland and then, of course, famously proceed to conquer modern Turkey, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and many other places. So this is the beginning of the imperial phase of Greek culture. And when Greece enters its imperial phase, we begin to see the creation of huge international networks of philosophical schools, such as the Stoics and the Epicureans. I'll come back to the Epicureans at the end of the lecture. The Skeptics were one of these. They weren't quite as big as the Stoics and the Epicureans, but they were one of this school. And in fact, actually, they were the inheritors of Plato's school in Athens. The academy was the philosophical school founded by Plato. But the Skeptics were very different to Plato. Plato had been a metaphysical thinker primarily. He thought that you could distinguish our world, which is a world of appearances and illusions, from a higher realm of truth, which was accessible through the mind only. So Plato distinguishes between the body, which is material and part of our world and sort of chained down to this terrible world of illusions and so forth, from the mind, which could travel into the world of reality, the higher world, the higher plane of reality. Now, Plato's ideas were developed from those of his teacher, Socrates, who wrote nothing himself. The Skeptics also claimed descent from Socrates, but they came through a very different route. Now, one of Socrates' tactics in argument had been to reduce his opponents to a state of absolute inability to respond whatsoever. So typically what happens in Socratic dialogues is somebody will say, I'll tell you what courage is. And Socrates goes, that's very interesting. Tell me what courage is. And gradually, in the course of the discussion, the other person's confidence in their ability to define courage or piety or whatever ebbs away. And that person realizes that they have no secure grasp on the definition of this term. This is what the Skeptics took up. The Skeptics loved this idea that actually the best thing philosophy could do was reduce people to the situation where they couldn't make any decisions whatsoever. It's like Buridan's ass. You know Buridan's ass, the donkey that is equidistant between two piles of grain and starves to death because it has no way of deciding between the one and the other. That's a very Skeptic position. For every positive argument, the Skeptics argued, there is an equally forceful countervailing argument proving the other way. So the ideal position for a Stoic was what they call epocher, which means suspension of judgment. The most philosophical person is the person who doesn't take any position on anything whatsoever. So it's a very interesting, slightly self-defeating position. But this applies to gods as well, and this is where we rejoin our discussion. And one head of the Skeptic Academy in the 2nd century BCE, a really interesting guy called Clitomachus of Carthage, seems to have written a book, amongst his 200 or so books that he wrote, seems to have written a book called On Atheism. He seems to have coined the abstract noun atheism. Here, he wove together a series of arguments against the existence of gods. Now, we don't have this text, again, you'll notice a pattern here with classical scholarship generally that, we tend not to have the text itself, we have some later echoes of it and so forth. And that's the case here as well. We do have a summary of these arguments in a source from the 2nd century CE, known as Sextus Empiricus, if you're interested in that. But as I say, we have the outlines of the arguments, and there are some absolutely fascinating arguments preserved here, including one, for example, that the idea of moral gods is illogical. So Cleistomachus argued that morality consists in making the right judgment between alternatives. Okay. Now, since gods are perfect, they never have to make that choice. So if you imagine that a virtuous decision would be you are President of the United States, let's take an example, and you're faced by a decision about a sort of a rogue power abroad that is developing nuclear weapons, for example. I'm getting into dangerous territory here. But if you imagine in that sort of situation, the virtuous decision, I'm not going to say which one is the right or wrong decision here, but the virtuous decision has got to be a choice between either engaging or not engaging, or pressing the button or not pressing the button or whatever. In that situation, the President of the United States has the opportunity to display virtue because he has choices to make. Now, the argument in this situation is that if gods are perfect, they never have that choice to make because they're never faced with imperfect decisions. So they never actually make a moral decision. And it's the same with every other virtuous act, if you like. A god will never display courage because they can't feel fear. Okay, so it's really interesting, sort of a set of arguments like this that Cleistomachus put together that show us, if you like, how difficult it is to sustain the idea of a god using human language. Now, these arguments, as I say, were originally designed as a part of a proof that arguments against the existence of gods were equally strong as arguments for the existence of gods. They weren't atheistic arguments in terms of the ultimate trajectory. That wasn't Cleistomachus' aim, wasn't to prove that gods don't exist. His aim was to prove that you should not make a decision whether gods exist or not. You should be in this perfect medial position, suspended in your disbelief, like Buridan's ass, between the two piles of grain, believing in God or not believing in gods. Very interestingly, however, the atheistic arguments seem to have been uncoupled from the theistic arguments very early on, and in fact, possibly by Cleistomachus himself. As I say, it seems clear that his book was actually called On Atheism, so he didn't actually put his atheistic arguments next to the theistic arguments. He allowed them to circulate separately. And certainly by the 2nd century CE, by the Roman period, we have really strong evidence that there are handbooks of atheism. In fact, actually, we have one of them, preserved by a writer who we know as Aetius. It almost certainly wasn't his name. Now, this handbook is interesting not just for the arguments it contains, but also for the ways in which it presents these arguments. It's the rhetoric, if you like, in which they're wrapped up. Okay, so Aetius's textbook of atheistic arguments does two very interesting things. One is to link these atheistic arguments to prestigious figures from the past, which is, in this era, it's a very classicizing era. It's an era that looks back to classical Athens as a source of authority. So very clearly what this writer is doing is trying to say these atheistic arguments, they have a deep heritage. They are really authoritative, that they are rooted in the prestigious culture of classical Athens, and we can attach names to individual aspects of the argumentation. So that's one thing that this author of this handbook does. The other thing that's really interesting is that he engages in angry abuse of the nonsensical folly of those that believe in the gods. And that's interesting because it shows evidence for group formation, if you like. This is the way, it's exactly the same kind of rhetoric that you get in the philosophical schools at this time and indeed in early Christianity as well. This sort of abusive language that you use towards people that you want to construct as others, as outsiders to your groups. So as I say, by the 2nd century CE, I think we've got pretty strong evidence that atheism is a position. It's a philosophical position. We've got the arguments knitted together into a whole. We've got texts that are circulating that are designed to plug you as a reader into a trans-historical, trans-temporal, if you like, network, virtual networks, rather like a sort of social media thing, to plugging you into a network of people who have throughout the ages not believed in gods. And we've also got a sense that by not believing in gods, you are better than other people. Okay? That's very interesting indeed. In the case of Aetius' handbook, we have a form of atheism that is not a million miles away from our own. I mean, clearly, anyone that's spent any time on social media will know that this is how contemporary atheists argue today. With a sort of very sort of rationalistic procedures coupled with a lot of sort of abuse of people for being stupid, or whatever, basically, the other camp. So it's not a million miles away from the kind of stuff that we see, as I say, in social media today. What we don't have, though, is any social history for this text, even in the 2nd century CE, which is a relatively rich period for evidence. We don't know next to nothing about the kind of people that are reading texts like this. We don't have any strong evidence for why people are reading it, what class of people are reading it, whether women are reading as well as men, whether slaves are reading, and so forth. We just don't know this kind of material. It'd be great to know more about this. But unfortunately, we don't have the institutional history of atheism in this era, partly because there isn't really a strong institutional structure for atheism. Or is there? I'm now moving into the final stage of my lecture, where I want to change the line of vision a little bit. Now, I mentioned at the start of this paper that we should allow the Greeks to define atheism themselves, rather than imposing our own modern categories. And there is one group of ancient thinkers who were associated more than any others with atheism. These were the Epicureans, the followers of Epicurus, who in the late 4th century BCE instituted a philosophical school based around the idea that reality consisted of matter and void and nothing more. There is no divine management of the world and no afterlife. So what you should do, what your responsibility to do, is to maximize happiness, not just for yourself, but for your fellow human beings. Now, if you asked most people in the ancient world to identify some atheists, their answer would probably be the Epicureans. The Epicureans were, after Diagoras of Milos, who I mentioned earlier, the Epicureans are most systematically associated with atheism. But this is the interesting thing. The Epicureans were not exactly atheists as we would understand them today. The Epicurean view of gods was flexible, perhaps even inconsistent. It's been repeatedly argued over by modern scholars. Modern scholars can't really agree on what the Epicureans thought about gods. Now, we don't have all of Epicurus' writings. You'll see the pattern again and again and again here. But we do have a passage surviving on a papyrus, an ancient piece of text surviving in Egypt, a passage in which he attacks the lunatics, as he calls them, who reject belief in gods. So Epicurus himself thinks you're mad if you don't believe in gods. Now, some Epicureans, including probably Epicurus himself, believed in gods who exist remotely from our world, in the gaps between worlds, in fact. They don't intervene in our world. They are like us, made of matter and void. They're not made of spirit or anything. And we only know of them because, like other material beings, they emit tiny particles. This is what Epicurus thought. This is how perception operates in Epicurean thought. The reason I can see you now and you can see me now is because we're all emitting tiny particles that go into our eyes, and our brains decode them. Trust me, it's true. And anyway, that's how we know of the existence of gods, according to Epicurus, is because sometimes when we're asleep, the gods emit these super fine particles that can travel through our atmosphere and just about make their way into our dreaming minds. And that's how we get a sort of intuition of the understanding of gods. But in fact, although Epicurus seems to have held a position a bit like this, we have an awful lot of Epicurean writing, actually later Epicurean writing. But the Epicurean position on the gods is very hard to identify with any confidence. None of our major Epicurean texts deals with it. And in fact, Lucretius, the most important text for Epicureanism, Lucretius, the great Roman poet, brilliant poet, says at one point, I'm going to tell you all about the gods, but I'll do it later, and he never gets around to it. So you can see there's a problem. The Epicureans never really come clean on what they believe about the gods. What is absolutely clear, though, is that Epicureans thought the gods would never punish you for wrongdoing or reward you, that the only punishment and reward can come in our world. Prayer and ritual are useless, except as a form of therapy. If there are gods, they are powerless gods who have no real impact on our world at all, except insofar as humans choose to organize religious rituals about them. So the Epicureans, were they atheists? Were they atheists or not? That's a really interesting question. They weren't atheists in our sense, but they were clearly atheists in an ancient Greek sense because they are so routinely associated with atheism. The word atheism we're beginning to see was bigger and more accommodating in the ancient world, and it never lost this negative sense, the sense that it might be, for some it was an in-group label, clearly, but for others it was also an out-group label, a way of defining people that had beliefs that were beyond the pale. So it was only the enemies of the Epicureans that called them atheists. But I want to conclude by showing how, if we change the lens in this way, and if we begin to see atheism in a more capacious, generous way in classical antiquity, it was really a widespread phenomenon because the Epicureans were absolutely huge in antiquity. So this will be my final proof, I hope, in my argument, that to understand how atheism operated in classical antiquity, we need to use ancient terms of reference ourselves, and we need to build in a certain level of humility, if you like, and not think that we're looking for the ancient equivalent of Richard Dawkins. We need to understand the big world of antiquity and the big, flexible, capacious world of antiquity, that didn't really have a fixed, solid idea of atheism. Rather, it had a sort of a spectrum of possible ways of understanding what atheism is. So, we're now in the 2nd century CE. Let's zoom in a little bit. Here we are in the Roman Empire, and I'm going to take you to this part here, which is in modern Turkey, but was in ancient, in the Roman province of Syria. Now, in about 120 CE, a young chap was born. Of course, he was young because he was born. This person here, Lucien, this is an 18th century engraving, this one here. Lucien the Satirist here. We don't know what he looked like. This is the only image that I could find. Now, Lucien was, as I say, was born over here in modern Turkey, right at the edges of the Roman Empire. And he never lost that sense of being an outsider. He joked about his origins in the East, and he often captured some of the snide mockery of his barbarian accent and his funny clothes. But nevertheless, his fame spread throughout the Roman Empire, partly as an orator with a masterful command of the Greek language, but more specifically as a remorseless satirist of human behavior. And clearly that's what this 18th century bookplate is telling you that he is. He's a satirist. He's somebody that exploits that marginal position. This is what satirists always do. Satirists sit on the outside, poking in. And Lucien liked the idea that he was a marginal figure in the Roman Empire who was throwing in barbs from the outside and satirizing and exposing the folly at the heart of human behavior. Now, amongst the aspects of human behavior that he satirized was, predictably, religion. Lucian was, in fact, the earliest pagan Greek writer explicitly to mention Christians, which was enough to condemn him in the eyes of later Christians. In the Byzantine world, he was known as Lucien the Atheist, another use of this nickname, and an eternity of hellfire was prophesied for him. The Catholic Church in the 17th and 18th century put him on the notorious index of prohibited books. But in fact, Lucien wasn't really interested in Christianity. Christianity was a really small cult in the 2nd century. It wasn't really till the mid-3rd century that Christianity took off as a movement. Lucian's real target was the vanity of mainstream religion around him. And of course, that meant for him the traditional Greco-Roman worship of the Olympians. Lucian wrote an essay attacking the practice of blood sacrifice, the centerpiece of all ancient religions. Why on earth, he said, would the gods want us to burn the inedible parts of dead animals? This is what Greeks do when they sacrifice. They cut animals up, dead animals up. They keep the nice bits for themselves. They eat them themselves, and then they burn the inedible bits for the gods. And Lucian says, what on earth is going on there? Why would the gods want inedible bones and fat to be burnt into a cinder? Why do we think that pleases them? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And why would beings that are, anyway, blessed and immortal, why would they care about what transient mortals like us get up to? Why would gods reward you for sacrificing rather than for doing good things to your fellow human beings? Another essay attacks the idea of funerals, very familiar kind of position to adopt. Why do we weep and wail over the dead, he says? Do we think it makes any difference to them whatsoever? No, of course not. We're just trying to make ourselves feel better, he says. So Lucian's full of this sort of very sceptical, very snide, if you like, a sort of outsider's perspective on the folly of human behavior. But one remarkable satire that I want to finish up with is called Zeus the Tragic Singer. This is cast in the form of a dramatic dialogue. We open on Mount Olympus, where the gods live, of course, where Zeus is weeping and wailing, hence the name Zeus the Tragic Singer, because tragedy is all about weeping and wailing. It soon turns out that the reason for this sorrow is that there's a public debate down there in the world of mortals, a debate between a Stoic philosopher and an Epicurean philosopher. The Stoic philosopher's name is Timocles, the Epicurean philosopher's name is Damis. And the debate is on the nature of the gods. The Stoic is arguing that the gods have an important formative effect on human destiny, and they shape human providence for the best. The Epicurean, by contrast, argues that there are no gods, and that our world is completely devoid of divine influence. Zeus's fear, and the reason why he's weeping and wailing like a tragic singer, is that the Epicurean will win the argument. They've already had one round of argumentation, as Zeus was so worried that he made night come in early. But he couldn't postpone day forever, so the day has come up, and the crowds have gathered around again. And as the dialogue opens, Zeus opens the gates of heaven and invites the gods to peer down into the world of mortals and listen to the arguments. And the rest of the dialogue, until we get the closing frame at the end, the rest of the dialogue is about the discussion between Damis and Timocles on the nature of the gods and whether gods exist. And it's absolutely wonderful text. I'm going to give you the arguments that the atheist, if you like, Damis, the Epicurean, comes up with. And I'm going to give you these in the form of a list, because I'm an academic, and that's what academics do. They turn things into lists, bloodless lists. Do you know that, you probably don't know this, this is sort of an English trope, if you like, about the Oxford professor who's overheard walking down the towpath in Oxford saying, "and 13thly." So this will be a bit like that. Actually, only 10 points. I'm not selling this very well, am I? So point one, there's no argument or proof that will allow you to demonstrate the existence of gods, says Damis. Again, this language of proof, this very rationalistic, rigoristic language of proof, evidence, and plausibility, as I say, derived from the law courts. Secondly, there is no evidence for providence, he says. That's to say, the view that the gods are shepherding human existence for the best. In fact, actually, events seem to happen with completely randomly. Thirdly, the gods do not punish those who speak ill of them. You can stand up in public and say Zeus doesn't exist, and you won't get a thunderbolt through the brain. Fourthly, realistically, if we're thinking of the gods as arbiters of justice, how are they going to have the time to spread themselves over every single area of the cosmos? How are they going to perceive all those little acts of injustice and act upon them? There are so many people in the world. How's that going to work? Fifthly, we're getting through these, aren't we? Fifthly, the Stoic has argued for regularity in nature as evidence for divine. Now, this is really interesting in terms of, if you think about the sort of the modernity of this argumentation. It's a version of Paley's watchmaker argument that I'm sure many of you know. Paley argued in the 19th century, that was the 18th century, I can't remember, argued that about this, if you found a watch on a wristwatch, a normal watch, on the shore, and you opened it up, you would infer from the complexity of the machinery that it had a sophisticated creator. Paley's argument was then that if you look at the world around us, it's such a complex ecosystem that it must have a creator on the same analogy. That's basically what the Stoic has argued. But the Epicurean comes back at him and says, what's to say that the world didn't arise by accident in a complete jumble of chaos, rather than by providential creation? And what's to say also that the order that we see in nature didn't emerge over the course of time? Now, one way of understanding this is to think, this is not the way that Damis projected, but if you think about, for example, a river going down a mountainside in a serpentine path, over time that will regularize. That river will, the path will cut to the line of least resistance. Because that's how gravity works. It creates regularity and order from the top to the bottom. Similarly, Damis is arguing, regularity in nature might have been not there from the beginning as a result of providential design, but actually might have emerged over the course of time. So, interesting argument. Sixthly, the traditional stories about the gods are incoherent and immoral. It's a very familiar critique of the gods in Greco-Roman society in particular, that if you look at Homer and Hesiod, you see gods cheating and committing adultery and so forth. What's going on there? Damius says that's not a very laudable presentation of the gods. Seventhly, and this is another argument against the Stoic position, the Stoic has argued that religion is universal in humankind, and that from that we can infer that all people have an inbuilt sense of the divine. The Epicurean counters this argument by saying that actually, if you look at belief systems across the world, you'll find that they're very, very different, that the Egyptians worship animal-like deities, that some people worship deities in the form of stones and so forth. The Jews have one god, Greeks have many gods, and so forth. And in fact, this diversity in belief in the gods proves not that everyone has an inbuilt sense of the divine, but that when it comes to explaining the inexplicable, we're completely at sea, that everyone just makes it up ad hoc. Eighthly, oracles are presented as evidence for the gods having foreknowledge, but actually if you look at these oracles, Damius says, they're all ambiguous and they're untrustworthy. There's a famous one that you may have heard of this, the famous one in Herodotus about Croesus, the Lydian king with a great empire. He sees the rise of the empire of Cyrus the Great, so he goes to the oracle and says, should I attack Cyrus's empire in Persia? And the oracle replies, if you attack Cyrus, you will destroy a great empire. So Croesus thinks, goody, I'm going to go and destroy the empire of Cyrus. But of course, he ends up destroying his own empire. Damius, in Lucian's skit, cites examples like this as evidence for the fact that oracles don't actually tell the future. They're just very carefully worded so that they can admit of multiple possibilities. Ninthly, we are getting there. Most religious rituals, he says, are harmless. It doesn't really matter if you do this and that or whatever, praying and so forth. It doesn't do any harm to anyone. But some are not, he says. So the Greeks had a cult of Artemis at Tauris on the Crimea, where human beings were flogged. He says this is actually really bad. We shouldn't allow people to beat each other up in this way. And tenthly, finally, the Stoic has used the analogy comparing the universe to a ship. And if it didn't have a divine pilot, the Stoic has said, then it wouldn't sail in a straight line. It wouldn't sail in an orderly way. Damius responds, what's to say that the ship of the cosmos is sailing in anything like a straight line? He says it may be painted very nicely on the outside, it may look fine, but actually it's a complete mess on the inside. And if you look certainly at human society, you will see that the scallywags are running the show, and in fact the really virtuous people are set to doing the menial tasks like scrubbing the floor and so forth. So in fact, actually the world is not ordered in that optimistic way that the Stoic has presented it. As the skit comes to an end, the gods have to admit that Damius has the better argument. Now, at one level, as classicists, we're bound to reflect on the historically specific nature of Lucian's sketch. This is not something that could exist. I mean, we're laughing at it now, but I'm doing a certain amount of translation to make it funny for you. There are bits that tie it to that time. It's manipulation of specifically Stoic and Epicurean ideas about the gods. There are literary debts that I haven't mentioned here to the comic poet Aristophanes, for example, and the exploitation of very familiar features of Greek religion that don't transfer to our era, like sacrifice and oracles. These aren't features of conventional modern Western monotheistic religions. So as I say, it's crucial to be closely attentive to the features of a text like this that locate it within that era. But from a different perspective, what strikes me about Lucian's sketch is just how modern it all feels. It feels modern partly because of the structure of the humour, this sort of Pythonesque surrealism of gods worrying about mortals, arguing that they don't exist. But it also feels modern because these are the kind of arguments, many of them, that we still grapple with today. How do you prove, how do you demonstrate the existence of gods? Is there any validity to the argument that you need a concept of God to have a concept of morality? If there is a powerful, just God in the world, how then do we explain the existence of unchecked injustice? What about those situations where religious behaviour seems positively harmful to human beings? Does the widespread but diverse nature of religious belief across the planet show that we have a natural grasp of the divine as human beings? Or does it show simply that we have a million different ways of explaining the inexplicable? What kind of order is there in our world? And does it need to be accounted for in divine terms? So this modernity leads me to a very simple conclusion. On the one hand, religion is clearly a feature of human society which is massively variable across time and space. And the same is true for atheism. It takes different forms at different times, and we would expect that to be the case. There will always be people who don't believe in gods. Plato was right about that. That is nothing new about people not believing in gods. But their abilities to express themselves and the social and cultural frameworks through which they do so will vary hugely. Although ancient Greece did have forms of atheism that looked similar to ours, these weren't central to their society. Far more important, actually, in terms of a really influential movement in Greek society was Epicureanism. As I say, it's not identical to atheism as we understand it today, but it did have strongly atheistic components to it. Now, Epicureanism was a huge movement in the Roman Empire. The most substantial archive of ancient texts to survive from antiquity is, in fact, an Epicurean library from near Mount Vesuvius in 69. Near Mount Vesuvius, which erupted in 69 CE, which is why we have these texts actually, because they were carbonized in the eruption of Vesuvius. Actually, I'll just show you very quickly there. That's the Getty Villa in Malibu. That's not a complete non sequitur, because these texts were preserved in a building which we now know as the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum. The Getty Villa in Malibu is actually an accurate reconstruction of the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum. So the largest library, if you like, of texts that we have from classical antiquity is an Epicurean library. The largest inscription that we have, stone inscription that we have, comes from here a place called Inoanda, which is down there. It's sort of around there on the bigger map there. There's a little bit of it there. Originally 80 meters long, and this is an Epicurean inscription again. So Epicureanism is big in every sense. It's big in terms of numbers, but it's also big in the sense that its adherents were making huge gestures to the wider world. According to our old friend Diogenes Laertius, the guy that wrote the lives of the eminent philosophers, the friends of Epicurus were so many in number that they could hardly be counted by whole cities. Now, Epicureanism wasn't atheism, as I say, as we understand it today, but it was atheism as Greeks understood it. And it was centrally important to Greek society and Roman society too. Julius Caesar, for example, was a practicing Epicurean. So when we're talking about a social institution, we certainly need to see atheism as something that's historically variable, that takes different forms over time. But I suspect that, and this is the other side of the coin, I suspect that the arguments used for atheistic positions are, within limits, relatively constant across human existence. It doesn't actually take scientific modernity, it doesn't take the modern secular state, it doesn't take the European Enlightenment to come up with a demand for proof about the intervention of gods in our worlds. It just takes a certain personality type, and we know that human brains have different personality types encoded within them. Many of the arguments proposed by Lucian's Damis, like most of the atheistic arguments in our world today, are fundamentally about evidence and proof. Evidence, so you tell me that God exists and that God intervenes in our world. I want proof. That's the basic, if you like, the rock, what would you say, the fundamental core of the atheistic position across time and space. Despite all this variability of the institutions, as I say, I think this sense that there are certain kind of people that want proof of the existence of gods in our world, that's the core of it all. The British anthropologist Edward Evans Pritchard, operating in the mid-20th century, noted in his study of a Central African people called the Azande his surprise that witch doctors were seen by some people in this society as frauds. Evans Pritchard had gone into this society with the sort of colonial mindset of the time. He wasn't a complete idiot, of course, but he had that sort of that sort of sense that he was going to understand a primitive people. He was going to go to a people that were pre-industrial. And therefore, he assumed they would all be equally pious, because that's just the way that people have been taught to think about pre-industrial civilizations. But he found people there who said, no, of course, I don't believe any of this whatsoever. And in fact, Evans Pritchard came to the conclusion that this was a much more widespread belief than the positive view that the witch doctors are actually doing any good in this society. What he found, what Evans Pritchard found in the Azandi, was a lively skepticism based around the same principle that I've described here, that there are certain people who want proof, they want demonstration. Now, I hope to have shown you that the Greeks had something that was close to, but not identical with, the modern concept of atheism. I hope also that I've shown you just how complex, but also how exciting these questions of definition are. They were constantly trying to adjust our own language to try to accommodate ancient evidence. Whenever we study an ancient culture, or indeed a modern culture that is unlike our own, we're always forced to consider our language. Ancient history is in part an exercise in translation. It's an attempt to translate ancient evidence into a language that makes sense for us now. But it's also, and it has to be, an exercise in recognizing the limitations of our own language to express ideas which are not our own. It's about what is lost in translation as well as what is gained by the act of translation. Perhaps more important then than asking, did the Greeks have a concept of atheism, is to ask, what can we learn for us now in our society from this act of humility that always goes with trying to understand an ancient culture on its own terms, and particularly a culture like the Greeks that gave us the word atheism and gave us so many thinkers that are that have shaped our modern conception of atheism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you have a question, raise your hand and somebody will give you a mic. I'm going to go first this time. I know I never do this before. I've never done this before. Because I got a question from Philadelphia, a fellow by the name of James Herbert. And the question is, as I am sure you know, over the past decade, a movement called the New Atheism has gained considerable traction. The movement is almost associated with four writers, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett, all of whom fight the impact of religion on secular society and who argue that the existence of gods can be treated as a naturalistic scientific hypothesis. Given the extensive record of atheistic thought you reviewed, I'm wondering if you believe there's anything actually new, quote unquote, in the so-called New Atheism. Is this movement essentially modern wine in new bottles? Or is there anything truly new about the New Atheism?
Yeah, very interesting question. When I published the book, the American publisher wrote a very nice blurb on the inside cover in which he said, the first thing he said was, "How new is atheism?" And when I read that, I didn't get it immediately. I said, he said, yeah, because it's reference to the new atheists and the idea that this book might be turning that on its head and saying we're talking about the old atheism. I think I would come back to the position that I concluded the talk with, which is that when it comes to the arguments, I think there is a certain level of consistency across time and space, because, I mean, the old atheists, if you like, were making scientific claims. They were saying truth, evidence, proof, and so forth. These should be the bedrocks of our procedure when we go about trying to understand our world. And that is basically the position that Dawkins and Dennett and so forth adopt. Also, something I didn't talk about so much, but this idea that the ethics, a humanistic ethics, should be based on the principle that we have one life and we better live it now, rather than deferring our thinking about our morality in terms of what will come in the afterlife. That's a central principle of Epicurean thought, and that's clearly at the heart of many of someone like Sam Harris would argue that as well. So in a sense, yes, there is this very strong continuity, and this is really underpinning my argument for continuity of argumentation. But I think the impact of the New Atheists has been much stronger and much more forceful and also much more divisive, I think, than anything that we saw in classical antiquity. It wasn't, I mean, what we're facing now in our world is, amongst other things, the product of the separation of church and state that we've had sort of historically going on the last sort of 300, 400 years and so forth, and the way in which science and faith in particular have set themselves against each other in Christian context, coupled with the globalization of the world, which means the rapid movements of people and sharing of ideas and so forth, which has created a very specific historical environment in which atheism and secularism have come to play a very important role, and have come to be felt as very threatening by certain groups of people that want to hold on to their traditional identities. So in that respect, new atheism, as a historical phenomenon, it's entirely different to anything that we've seen before.
And we're going to go to a couple of student questions. Caitlin Duffy in back, and then I think Bob has a question after.
If a form of atheism has been around for so long as you presented, why is it so commonly accepted among the public that it is relatively new occurrence?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's because we have all acquiesced in a collective fiction here, which is something like, it's the story of the Enlightenment, really, that the European Enlightenment plays such a central role in the definition of modernity. If you ask anyone when the modern period started, they would probably say, sort of 18th century onwards. That's partly about the European Enlightenment. It's of course partly about the sort of the founding fathers and so forth, and the ability to create new states, new modern states and so forth. So, atheism is very closely linked in our imagination now with modernity, because modernity is seen. This is not entirely just different to what we saw in classical Athens, but modernity is seen as a way of uncoupling ourselves from a religious past. And not everyone would agree with that particular diagnosis of it. And of course, there are many people that would want to sort of wrap religion back into the story of modernity. But there are also many religious believers who would see that story as essentially true, but also demonstrating that modern modernity is itself flawed, and that we need to get back to a sort of pre-Enlightenment sense of community and faith and so forth. But I think ultimately it is about that sort of the central role that the European Enlightenment plays in the definition, not just, I would say, of modernity, but also of Western modernity. This is another crucial dimension here, because the modern West thinks of itself as different along two axes. One is time and the other is space. It thinks of itself as different from the past, but it also thinks of itself as different from another part of the world that is still held to traditional ideas and is in a pre-scientific state. And I should stress that that's not, I say that not because I'm suggesting that's the right way to think, but I'm saying that as a sort of observation of the way in which the narratives of modernity have been constructed.
So, kind of my own observation, in a sense, over here. I believe it was, did you say it was Didarius who made the shift from the negative to positive perspective?
Diagoras, yeah.
Diagoras, thank you. So I'm thinking about that. Someone who's known for making the shift from a negative to positive perspective in terms of these in-groups and out-groups. And I wonder, we put so much emphasis on morality and religion, which I know you said not to focus on initially, but I myself am a follower of a Coptic Christian religion. I go to church every Sunday, and very rarely do I find individuals of my age or younger attending. And so I'm torn between my own personal beliefs and, I guess this generation that is encompassing more of an atheist or agnostic, perhaps, approach. And I just wonder, do you think that this is the current day in-group? Does there exist, perhaps, this shift from a negative to positive perspective in terms of theism to atheism, respectively, perhaps in today's, or my generation at least? So,
sorry, you're saying that the shift from in-group to...
So I'm finding myself kind of becoming part of the out-group in terms of my generation. And I know it's kind of a touchy question, but...
No, I think that is right, and I think that's part of the reason why atheism feels so threatening to so many people, is because it does feel as if it's taking something away, and particularly, not just religious belief, but also culture as well. As a Copt, mm-hmm. you presumably feel not just that your religion is bound up with your beliefs about God, but it's actually bound up in a very ancient form of Christianity. I mean, of course, the most ancient form of Christianity on most accounts. So, I'm somebody who spends most of my time trying to preserve things from the past, not necessarily fossilize them, but tries to, the idea of losing aspects of ancient culture seems to me very perilous indeed. And I recognise that tension. I mean, I don't have an answer to it, but I think you've diagnosed the problem exactly. That we are now in a stage where there are religious belief systems, there are languages that are disappearing, there are traditional narratives, there are traditional buildings and so forth that are disappearing at an extremely quick rate, and we have to make very difficult choices about, whether we want to preserve or whether we want to accelerate into the future, and what the costs and benefits of those are. And as I say, I don't pretend there is an easy answer to that, but good luck.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank President Rippich for formulating this idea with Anouar, which has been a wonderful seminar for the last 8 years. I really appreciate all you have done. Not only for this center, but for the entire state of Maine. I think it is incredible. You have done more in the time I have been in Maine in the last 40 years than anyone else I can remember.
I love him.
And now my question is, you mentioned the problem of evil in premise 1 and premise 2. And I'm wondering if there was ever any discussion of a premise 3 evolving around like an absolution for the people who, and I can't remember if the evil ones were premise 1 or 2, but did they ever go into the fact that, oh, I'm evil, but now I can buy my way out of it?
It's very interesting that in the Greek example, we don't talk about evil. It's not the problem of evil, it's a problem of injustice. Evil is really a Judeo-Christian, and more specifically a Christian concept. So in the Greek case, what we have is, so premise 1, as I was presenting it, was if the gods exist, they will punish wrongdoers and they will reward the virtuous. Premise 2 was if we look around in the world around us today, we can see that there are virtuous people who are not rewarded, and we can see wicked people, unjust people who are not punished. Therefore, the conclusion is that the gods don't arbitrate when it comes to justice. So it may be a fine distinction between evil and injustice, but I think it's an important one because that gets to the heart of your question, which is about absolution, which is really about sort of a state of the soul, really, isn't it? That if you are evil, if you have the stain of evil within you, there might be theological ways of removing that from you. The Greeks never think like that. They never think that a person is evil, that they have evil within them. They think of actions that can be just or unjust. And the idea of an action being just or unjust is intrinsically tied to that legalistic perception of things. That's to say, an unjust action is an action that deserves to be punished, whether by humans or by gods. A just action is one that deserves to be rewarded and commended. But it's a very sort of simple institutional way of understanding things. It's not an internalized sense that there is something within you that is good or bad. And they certainly don't have any sense of original sin or anything. And that's a very alien idea to the Greeks. When the Bible is translated into Greek, into the Septuagint, the Greeks have to use a very rare word to capture the idea of sin, a word that means something like sort of wandering around quite a lot. So yes, I mean, so the short answer is no, they don't have a concept of absolution, because you don't need a concept of absolution if you don't have a concept of sin.
We have a question right here.
I was just curious. We talk about atheism a lot, and I teach philosophy at the Biddeford campus, and we were talking about the difference between strong and weak atheism in modernity. And I was curious about the difference between what you're talking about with the Greek atheism, which actually had to do with gods that were a bit more immanent, a bit more material, versus like a strong atheist like Richard Dawkins today, who is actually trying to prove it's not just the atheism, like a lack of theism, but he's actually invested in a belief that there is no God, and that's in itself a form of faith. And I think that strong atheism is very different from the Greek, I think. I was just going to ask your opinion on it, because it's about a transcendent God, not a material God, that you can prove with material or empirical stuff.
Yes, yeah, well, thank you for that, Marissa. I think certainly not believing in a single transcendent God is different to not believing within a polytheistic context, because one of the things we have to remember is that we're not just talking about the 12 Olympians, we're talking about nymphs, we're talking about sort of all sorts of demigods, we're talking about personified abstractions like virtue and victory and things like that. So ultimately the Greeks have a very capacious idea of what the divine might be, and being an atheist in all of those categories would take you an awful long time, if you like, to work your way around them. So most of them do target particular areas here. Whether that makes them weaker atheists, I don't know. I mean, I think certainly the points of continuity that we were talking about earlier when Anouar asked his question, his ventriloquized question, are evident, I think, that time and again people come back to this idea of whether there is any demonstrable proof for the existence of gods in our world, or the intervention of gods in our world, or for any kind of divine activity in our world. And this really is, in a nutshell, that's Dawkins' position as well. Dawkins himself says, I'm 99% confident that there are no gods. But he says, being a scientist, I have to follow evidence and I can't exclude anything because there is no, I don't have a universal command on control of evidence. My own view is more like Julian Baggini's view of atheism, that if you ask any atheist to demonstrate the level of commitment to the belief in the non-existence of gods that a believer would have in the existence of a god, then you're kind of being unfair, really, on atheists, because atheism really, by definition, is a rationalistic mode of engagement with the world that is evidence-based and so forth, and is, like any form of scientific engagement, is liable to change. I mean, you can always, new evidence can come up, so you can change your theories and so forth. So atheists are never going to have certainty about divinity. Nevertheless, atheists live their life without reference to gods, and that is, in Baggini's definition, that's a better way of understanding what atheism is. If you don't have God in your life, then you can call yourself an atheist. And it seems to me that's a better way of looking at things. But no one in antiquity says that, by the way.
I heard a number of years ago that the majority of Mainers don't identify with any religion, so they're either agnostic or atheist. But the atheists or agnostics that I know are afraid to say anything about it because they think they're going to be ostracized from our society. So my question is, were the ancient atheists ostracized? Did they feel like outsiders?
That's a very good question. In classical Athens, there is evidence that there was actually, so in about 430 BCE, Anaxagoras, who is the philosopher that Socrates mentions at his trial, the philosopher who believes that the heavenly bodies are made out of rocks rather than divinities, he was faced with a lawsuit that was a particularly severe form of lawsuit called an asangelia, which basically means that you are corrupt, you are threatening to disrupt the entire Athenian democracy. You're an enemy of the state, basically. And the reasons for this were that he taught that there were no gods, allegedly. And this legal precedent was evoked on a number of occasions to attack Diagoras of Milos. So I mentioned the guy who seems to have flipped around the word atheist to mean something more positive, and indeed Socrates himself. He seems to have been swept in under this kind of measure. So there was an awful lot of in late classical Athens, when these ideas are being formed and they're first getting sort of written expression, there was an awful lot of anxiety and tension about them. But by and large, throughout classical antiquity, you don't get that level of paranoia about atheism, partly because it's not a culture of orthodoxy. You don't have sacred texts. You don't have defined notions of what it is or of what divinity is. So atheism is really one position on the spectrum of possible positions about the gods. Nobody has any orthodox conception of what a divinity is. And if you don't have an orthodox conception of divinity, then by and large, denying that gods exist whatsoever is perfectly legitimate. It's an extreme position, but it's actually not a blasphemous position. They don't have any concept of blasphemy.
So have we moved forward?
So have we moved forward? Well, yeah, it's a knight's move at best, isn't it?
We're going to go right down in front here.
This is actually closely related to the previous question. I was going to ask about whether there was any political suppression of atheism in the ancient world. And now I'd like to ask you to move to the 2nd and 3rd century of the Roman Empire, where there was definite threat about Christianity, and Christians accused, rightly so, of not being willing to sacrifice to the public gods of Rome, and persecuted for that. Were atheists or Epicureans also persecuted at the same time, or were they willing to do the sacrifices?
So to take the second question first about the Epicureans were not persecuted. They were sometimes treated as kind of strange people, and they were treated as the objects of mockery and so forth. But that's okay. You can live with that, can't you? And part of the reason for that was because they actually said that it's good to engage in state rituals, because that's what they were essentially about was building harmonious communities. So they don't want to create antagonism with other people, because they think the most important thing is human sociality. So if you start going around saying, I'm not going to do that, you're wrong, and so forth, then you are creating tension and anxiety in the world. So they said, even if you don't believe in these rituals at all, if you think they're completely harmless, they actually have a positive value in the sense that they are community-building exercises. The Christians, as you rightly say, didn't think that. At least they didn't think that. They thought that about their own rituals, but they didn't think that about the state rituals. The whole question of Christian persecution is a minefield, actually, for scholars. Candida Moss at Notre Dame wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Myth of Persecution or something, in which she argued that essentially Christianity had made up an awful lot of these stories about martyrdom and persecution, partly because the model of Jesus Christ was so important. The idea of being like Christ was, every Christian should model himself after Christ, but partly also because these stories were invented, she argues, in the Constantinian era when Christianity was the norm. So actually it gave Christians a sense of their own edginess, if you like. There's a sense of their own distinctness in relation to Roman society, a sense that they were not like other people, and it was a way of sort of building a Christian identity that was gradually separating itself off away from traditional Roman society. Now, whether you believe, the truth, as ever, lies somewhere in between. Where it lies in between, it can't be the case that there were no Christians persecuted. We know that there were. For example, in the middle of the third century, and the Emperor Decius said, I want to have signed witnesses that every single person in the empire is sacrificing to the imperial cult. It doesn't seem to have been applied systematically, but we do have some of these little slips surviving, and it seems pretty clear that some Christians were killed in that, and certainly later on, Diocletian, towards the end of the third century, very clearly did, clearly to me at least, did engage in some sorts of persecution of Christianity. Even earlier on as well, in the 1st century CE, Tacitus records, and Tacitus is no Christian himself, he says that the Christians were blamed for the fire at Rome and some of them were put to death. So some Christian persecution, if you want to call it that, occurred. But the ancient world was a bloody place, it was a brutal place, and all sorts of people got killed at different sorts of times. And it's also equally clear that Christians found this a very useful way of expressing their identity as the persecuted, victimized people. So as I say, I mean, that would be a whole lecture in itself. But that's the nub of the issue here. Is that one? I mean, you can tell from what I say that basically evidence is always the problem with classical antiquity. You have to go with your sources, or you criticize those sources, or whatever. And with the early Christianity, it becomes doubly difficult because it's a very colourful set of texts that are often very lurid, about sort of mothers being ripped from their children while their children are still feeding at their breasts and things like that, and thrown to lions that would then refuse to eat their mother because they were they fell down to praise the Lord and that sort of thing. And it's there's a lot of colour in these stories, and how much truth you actually detect in it is really going to be a question of judgment, I think.
So the first question wasn't mine, but the last question.
Yes, okay. Yeah.
So I when I used to teach my classes, I'd ask my students and said, "Does God exist?" They'd said, "Absolutely." And then I'd say, "How do you know that?" And they'd say, "It's in the Bible." And so you realize that God is mostly a text or a part of a tradition. And I think it's nobody experiences divinity as a natural phenomenon themselves. Would you, and the examples you gave from ancient Greece, would you say that was more also the case in the sense that when people talked about God, they were really talking about inherited traditional beliefs as opposed to having a natural experience with, or a cosmic experience with the divine?
Very interesting question. Yeah, so yes, I think it is primarily a question of whether you subscribe to inherited beliefs. And there are people that, for example, say inherited beliefs are entirely wrong, but I have a different sense of divinity. And there are people that say inherited beliefs are entirely wrong, therefore there are no gods at all. So rejecting traditional beliefs doesn't necessarily mean atheism. But yes, it's a very interesting way of expressing things that you've just come up with. I'm reminded of Origen, a Christian writer in the 3rd century CE, who wrote a text called Against Celsus. And Celsus was a pagan follower of traditional Greco-Roman religion. And essentially, Celsus is arguing that Christianity is nonsense, and Origen is arguing back at him. And there's one very fascinating moment in it where they're talking about miracles, and Celsus says, how can you believe in things like resurrection from the dead? How can you believe in the transformation of water into wine? These things are physically impossible. That proves that your religion is untrue. So Celsus is premising his position on observable reality and the naturalistic laws of the world around us. Origen flips that around and says, actually, the existence of these miracles is demonstrable proof for the divinity of Jesus Christ. So he's premising, his proof material, if you like, is the Bible. It's exactly what you're saying, that he's saying the Bible is true, that's just incontrovertible. And what we can conclude from that is Jesus' divinity based on that raw material of the Bible. And it's a very interesting sort of missing of minds, if you like, and a situation like that, where both of them are going at the same problem from an entirely different angle and come to completely different conclusions. And they structure their narratives of proof in very different ways.
Well, thank you so much.